Hello, everyone, and welcome to our episode 2 of It's in Denver's Nature podcast. This is a podcast produced in collaboration with Denver Parks and Recreation and Denver Community Media. Denver Community Media is owned and operated by the City and County of Denver. And if you would like more information about Denver Community Media, feel free to check us out at denvercommunitymedia.org. We're here in the studio with a few guests, some from episode 1. We have Gordon Robertson and Cincere Eades back from episode 1. And we have some new guests in the studio. We have Tina Bishop. Hi, Tina.
Hi, Ivana.
And hi, Bill Wenk. And I'd love for you both to sort of like introduce yourselves. Tell us what you do and, what your background is.
I'm a landscape architect, principal of the firm Mundus Bishop. We focus on planning and design. We do a lot of work in Denver. Our work you might be familiar with is master planning and design for some of the major city parks, Civic Center. We've also done a lot of work with parks up in the Denver Mountain Parks. So my background is landscape architecture, and I would just say that I'm really intrigued by stories, and I love really learning about culture and nature and how it impacts people through their recreational and outdoor experiences.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Bill, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am also a landscape architect. I'm semi-retired. I founded my firm, Wenk Associates, 40 years ago now, I think. It can't be that long. But came to Denver in 1970 and watched it grow and change a great deal over that period of time. And our work evolved considerably over time. We ended up with a focus on urban water resources, which sounds very technical and formal, but the influence that type of work on parks has been profound, locally and nationally, and of course has become kind of one of the key issues of our time. Beyond that, we've branched out considerably into urban design and larger areas of redevelopment, but parks has always been one of our core practices.
In this episode, we're going to discuss in depth the history of parks, specifically in Denver, and the history of park design, and that's why we have you both to just hear from your expertise. Diving more into the history of parks. First of all, Tina, do you have a favorite park? And can you tell me maybe a little bit about the story of that park?
I have a lot of favorite parks, but I do have one of my favorite stories really is about what a lot of residents in Denver know as the People's Park. And that is a name given to Denver City Park by a planner in the early 1900s, Charles Mulford Robinson, who was really instrumental in the first planning of the park system. And what's great about City Park is that it is Denver's largest park, built and designed in 1882 in the English Landscape Gardening School style and tradition, although it's changed over time. The story is really about when we were master planning for the park. In 2018, 2019, we had the ability to hear from the community residents about some of their favorite stories. And there were lots of stories about we love the waterway, we climb in there, our kids go to the museum, we go to the playground. We love the idea that it has all the institutions. But my favorite story and our team's favorite story from that experience was really an elderly woman, came in a wheelchair with her family, and she came specifically to tell us stories about the park. And one was as a child growing up, her mom was a restroom attendant at the City Park Pavilion. And so her and her brother would run around and scamper around the park as kids. At that time, they could get into the zoo. Not sure if it was like porous and you could get in and out, or if it was just really a doorway that was open at the time. And then their mom would come at lunchtime and come and find them and make sure they were okay. But her experience was really just that freedom of being in City Park. It was a wonderful story.
I like how a little bit of the highlights of the story is about considering a park as like a place of congregation where people come together and play. And going back in history a little bit, can you tell us maybe what prompted the design of these parks, and where did the original landscape designers, where did they take inspiration from?
That's a great question. Big question.
Yeah.
So what's really great, I think, about Denver's legacy and our park legacy is that it really was an early inspiration. Denver, when it was the three cities, Auraria, Highlands, and Denver, really had park planning at mind. The city leaders at the time and residents were really looking to take this dusty prairie, what was considered sort of the Queen City of the Plains, really to take that and turn that into a livable place. So even as early as 1858, 1859, there were park pockets that were planned. Most people have heard of Frederick Law Olmsted having a big influence. His influence in Denver was really about setting aside land and doing that as a way to set aside land for all. And then combining this idea of health and wellness and using outdoor spaces with the ideals that promoted social consciousness. So it was really this concerted effort. Denver picked up on that. By the time we get to the early 1900s, we're really heavy into park planning and design. It didn't hurt that Denver became the center of the region with the state capital in the 1880s. And then, of course, a really big influence on Denver and across the nation was the 1893 World's Exhibition that really set the stage across the country for the City Beautiful movement. At Denver, it really was part and parcel of also the progressive era. And as I talked about the 1870s and 80s being social reform, by the time we get to the 1900s in Denver, it was really a beginning of a widespread period of social activism and reform. We saw that in our parks. And we really saw that in that early park design when designers were looking at proportion, harmony, and nature. And it's been written about our parks. Many of the designers were looking at the inspiration that we have just from the setting, from the mountains, our relationship to the mountains, also our relationship to the high plains and that arid desert and water. You know, Bill talked about water being part of his introduction, and that was a big part of it.
How have these parks, some of these major parks, urban parks within Denver, how have they changed throughout the years?
Early park planning was really about, like the English gardening school at City Park is designed on, this winding paths, this experience through nature, this idea that you're bringing nature into the city, which is what I love about current practices that Denver Parks is doing, because we're kind of going back to those ideals. And there was really about what you would bring people in. And you have to remember at the time, it was a pretty industrial city, you know, there wasn't a lot. It was about shade trees. It was a lot more about trees and open meadows. Meadows were clover. There were stories of, you know, goats tending to some of the large open meadows, not really mown. The idea of the irrigated bluegrass came later and filled some of those. And there's French design, civic centers, Beaux-Arts style, all across Europe that were coming in, and designers were being influenced by those here in Denver. So we saw a lot of different styles.
I don't know if you've heard of George Kelly, but he was a horticulturalist. I know Tina has.
Oh, I love George Kelly. Totally love George Kelly. He's amazing.
And there's a book I still have one. I'm sure it's not in print, but I think there's a great deal of emphasis on native stone, and George Kelly was a plantsman, and he knew the natives, and he would tell you what will work well. It's a very good reference, by the way, if you can find one in a used bookstore. S.R. DeBoer, you look at the Monaco Parkway and or in Washington Park, the groves of evergreens are classic kind of mountain landscapes that I think are unique to Denver and to DeBoer. And DeBoer, of course, also planted thousands of crab apples, which was also another signature kind of planting type that really added a layer of richness to the more classic expression of City Beautiful.
So I'm going to challenge a little bit just for fun. I would
Good.
I would say that the natural aspect of early design in parks was an idealized version of nature, and it wanted to take it in a way that was comfortable for people, rather than really creating nature in the city. And I think that's what we might be thinking we want to do today, is to create more true ecosystem opportunities in our parks. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's an argument there that it was really about people enjoying an idealized version of nature, and maybe that isn't working as well for us today.
I think it's a both and.
Yeah.
It is. I think we need to have actual functioning nature out there, whatever that is, in an urban context. And of course, there is no real nature it's all managed,
Right.
no matter where you are. On the other hand, and it's very functional at a number of levels. On the other hand, I think I like to think of it as a middle nature, a cultured nature that you're talking about, Gordon, that you feel like you're in Colorado, wherever that might be, but it's a very kind of contrived landscape where you feel comfortable.
And I love the Cheesemans and the Civic Centers. I think their design is spectacular. I think where we really went wrong in many ways was every neighborhood and local community park had to be perfect turf grass, and there wasn't really an opportunity in our nearby parks to do nature.
Yeah, welcome to 1948.
Yeah.
And a lot of the parks that, sort of happened, Bill, you talked about too, and the changes that were made, but there was a big effort in Denver parks in the late 40s to develop those neighborhood parks. And they were simple things that, and I think at the time were considered land, a lot of grass and a few trees, and they're easy to take care of, easy to maintain. So great opportunity for changing that today.
Are we sort of like removing ourselves away from this idea of idealized nature with the perfect bluegrass square? Where are we heading, and where should we be heading now?
To me, there's some kind of structural changes in the city that are happening. Transit is kind of slow start as it has had, and just the whole movement back into the city, which is now going through another transition that isn't really clear as a result of COVID. And so I think we're seeing a great deal of density that hasn't really been addressed in terms of park amenities. There's no land.
Right.
Some cities are answering that by building very, very expensive urban parks that are heavily programmed. In other words, lots of activities every day of the year, and a great deal of richness to them because there's so much going on. Discovery Green in Houston, Guthrie Green in Tulsa, and the list goes on. 3 acres, up to 25 acres, even larger, multi-million-dollar parks. Draw hundreds of thousands, millions of people a year, both tourists and locals. On the other hand, those don't necessarily meet the needs of a young family or somebody walking their dog or something like that. And so we've been working on a number of projects where streets become parks. Literally in Salt Lake City, which has streets that are 120 feet wide, the street is 120 feet wide. Designed that so you could turn a team of horses and a wagon around in it. Right now, we're converting a number of streets in the downtown to linear parks that also have a street in them, but much more kind of managed and reasonably sized. And I think the pop-up park that Parks did on, I think, 22nd Street, very close to
21st.
21st, was a really interesting experiment.
I'm so glad you brought up 21st Street Pop-Up Park, because I have 2 anecdotes from when we did that. This is a ballpark area of downtown, has no green space anywhere nearby. It's all concrete and asphalt. There's an adjacent condominium tower. Mm-hmm. And when we built that park, I had 2 people come down from the condominium tower and talk to me and say, "Thank you so much. I didn't know any of my neighbors. And
Wow.
now I have 10 new friends because you built this park. And I'm down here and I've met them.
Wow.
Otherwise, I never would have met them." And the other person that came to talk to me said, "Thank you so much again. This is amazing. Please let it be forever." I said, "Sorry." But she said, "I was on my patio and I heard a bird chirp. And I had not heard a bird chirp or sing," I forget what she said, since I've lived here for the last year.
Gordon, you're bringing 2 elements that I think are universal in terms of like park design and park system that I think are universal and really sustain themselves through time, which is congregation, meet your neighbors, and nature. Like, okay, you're hearing the birds chirping and you're in an urban setting, which is, kind of unusual. How do we keep that balance of like congregation and providing that sense of nature? How do we keep those 2 elements in balance as we, think of like park design in the future?
So I love when you talk about congregation, and what do people do in parks? Because part of it is recreation. So some of it's public assembly. There's all these different ways that we use the parks, and I love the idea that we can have all those things come together and coexist. We don't have to necessarily choose. We might have to choose by location or site or size.
And I think it's important that, like, as we've talked about the evolution of parks, that they've become more than just spaces for people to congregate, that they are multi-beneficial and they're infrastructure, right, for the changing climate and solving the urban heat island. And we need to embrace that they're providing more value than just a place to go play baseball, right? And so some of the work that we're doing is through our landscape typology study. And so it's gone in and mapped and collected data on the ecosystem function of those landscape types. We overlay irrigation data, and that helps us understand where do we have areas that we could consider non-functional turf, and return that back to a more native landscape and provide those environmental benefits.
And when you say non-functional turf, can you expand on that? Just what do we mean by non-functional turf?
There's a lot of definitions, and so there's broader definitions for kind of when you think about it on a citywide scale, but on a park scale, we have to be a little more detailed because we want to make sure we're not including areas that we do want to preserve for active recreation. So we're talking about spaces along the edge of a roadway where people aren't accessing the park, and cars are just driving by, and so it's not being utilized for any kind of recreational function. Or medians, especially if there isn't kind of a stopping over point for people to cross the road. Think about the islands in the middle of parking lots. We have a lot of, Berkeley Park has a very large island that is all turf, but it's not being utilized for any other purpose of just kind of being that median within the parking lot.
I think that was a great opportunity, your segue, Cincere, into talking about how historically early parks had sort of this, a little bit of, we were bringing nature into the city. We're talking about that now. We're talking about functional landscapes. And I think the big opportunity and responsibility, obviously, our responsibility is to really think about this and to create these landscapes for climate change, sustainability, and resiliency. But I also think it's a big opportunity in design, not to lose those principles of what makes a great design, what makes a great park. And I really love to see like the natural areas become a part of the composition, like you're talking about. There's like edges, maybe there's edges on the pathways.
Occasionally and regularly, I'll see people down in the creek doing things. So I've started to stop and talk to them. And one time, a couple of years ago, there was a guy down at one of the drop structures where the waterfalls occur, for everyone that doesn't know what a drop structure is. And he had a plastic lawn chair, and he was sitting on this little tiny island in his plastic lawn chair. And I said, "What are you doing? Why do you come here?" He says, "This is where I write poetry."
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
that's a good story.
Another time,
yeah.
I've got a better one.
Okay, good.
Very different. I'm biking through Glendale, actually, and the creek has really grown up there. I mean, it's very green. And I could hear music, and it was coming from the creek. And I'm going, "Oh, what in the heck is this?" So I got off my bike and kind of walked down the bank. And here was a group of half a dozen teenagers, a table right in the middle of the creek. And they were playing music and just hanging out. And I'm saying, "What are you doing here?" "Oh, we come here because we feel safe." Mm-hmm. Which is really, really interesting. People are figuring out how to use the creek in new ways that suggest new park types to me. And I've been intrigued with watching people and thinking, okay, how can we design these and bring them to any kind of trail corridors? Because we think of trail corridors like we think of highways. It's how to get from A to B as fast as we can, quite often. And we don't think of them as an experience in themselves, quite often.
Speaking of parks and park design, what kind of changes should we expect to see as Denver residents?
I think there's like these really wonderful examples, like the ones we just gave, where those are really good examples of how park design has been changing in the direction we're hoping to move toward, and that it becomes a real integrated piece. But I think there's also an opportunity to really have, I think Cincere, you brought this up, like where are those places in the city where it may not be about recreation or respite or relaxation, and it's really about restoration of nature. It's really about restoration of a creek or a hillside or a site, and it's either within the city, but it's also in the mountain parks. There's a huge need to sort of go back to some of the restoration of the natural systems on a bigger scale. So we have these two different systems where there's an opportunity to do that.
I'm really curious your thoughts on our historic parks like Cheeseman and going in and converting some of that historic landscape that and modernizing it and bringing it to a more native landscape, and your thoughts on kind of undoing that original landscape design and how that pairs with the architecture that's there and changing that.
When we did the master plan for Cheeseman, we realized that a lot of the walks had been taken out. And so when we did phase one, we put the walkway system back in. And the fear I would have of changing sort of that central piece would be more about when you go to Cheeseman Park, I mean, anymore, it is packed. It is wall to wall with people, right? And part of
Functional turf. Right
functional turf, right there.
Yes.
It's about congregation. But there are wonderful opportunities within the park. One of my big ones is the evergreen trees over by the pavilion, because we also worked with Botanic Gardens and did the entrance redo to have that be, you can get there in a fob now. It's pretty awesome. And there's a rose garden. So there's a real opportunity to think through that again. Unfortunately, you know, the gray water for those evergreens has not been so great. And so we are, as a department, you guys are looking the evergreen piece at Wash Park, designed by the Olmsted brothers. Really, those all, we're going to have to replace those at some point. So I think when we're doing that type of thing and thinking about the future, huge opportunity there, right? When you look at City Park, we integrated in the master plan a whole wetland environment on Farrell Lake, so we could really expand that. Came up with the idea the South Garden should be a meadow, right, the center, because it really wasn't being used. So I think there are those opportunities, and it's really about, for me, let's not throw out the composition to make the changes, but how do we create this next layer for the future? That's pretty exciting, actually.
Cool.
Yeah, is there a point to be made that when parks first were started, there were one or two or maybe three things that they had to provide the community, which were really very much, you know, human-based, kind of get out of the urban bustle and mentally and physically, you know, relax. That was kind of the goal, I think. But I think the park system has morphed into a resiliency for the whole city that we didn't really anticipate from a climate change standpoint, where all these little patches of green that were created just for people to get to play baseball or take a walk around the park back in the day are now critical for our well-being as a community and as a city. And so these parks have to do more. They have to provide more trees to clear the air. They have to absorb more rainwater to stop flooding. They have to do more than they used to do. And I'm wondering how we design them to accommodate additional outcomes.
They can do all of that and still be kind of a place for community and leisure and whatever activity gives you a richer life. It might be sports, it might be sketching turtles, whatever it is.
Whether it is connectivity, like you were talking about, now we're looking at how we can be more connected. Walkable cities, whether it's expanding the tree canopy or it's just not duplicating what you do in different places, right? So that you have a system of uses and a system of functions. Because early on, there were important functions that happened in each of the parks. It wasn't just like, I mean, even Du Bois Waterway, while it's this wonderful little aesthetic piece in City Park, it was meant to be functional, right? So we had all those things. So I think we're building on those ideals again, which is really awesome.
Well, thank you all for providing all your facts and knowledge about the history of parks and park design. Tune in for the next episode next month, where we will talk about water conservation.